Why does everyone love the longsword? The longsword might be one of the most iconic swords used in media. From medieval romances to modern fantasy epics, longsword has often been the weapon of choice. But what is a longsword? How does it distinguish from and what's its benefits over other swords? Why is it so beloved by media? Today we will investigate all of these questions. But before we will learn about its evolution to understand the distinction of the bastard sword, the longsword and the two-handed sword. To give some context, we start with the Viking sword, the grandfather of the longsword. We already see all the elements that we would see in a longsword. It is a wide and short-bladed weapon that was mainly made for cutting, with a very small guard and a thick pommel that were produced from the 8th to the 11th century. Within the 11th century, the knightly sword was born from the Viking sword. Within the transition period from the Viking sword to the knightly sword between the 10th and the 12th century, it was often called the Norman sword, due to a group of Vikings who settled in France and called the land Normand, which literally means Northman in Old French. I really love human creativity. The Norman swords gained larger cross guards and the pommel became rounder. For God's sake, yes. Look how the Viking pommel totally destroys your wrist. Imagine fighting with it for 2 hours or longer, it's just insane. The later swords got rounder pommels, the crossguard started to vary and the blade became more narrow. And the tip pointier to penetrate mail armor and get within the weak points of plate armor. By the 15th century, they were called arming swords as they were worn as a sidearm. All the swords we discussed until now were used together with a shield in the empty hand, except maybe the sidearm sword given the name. But they were also worn with bucklers, so... Within the 13th century, many swords which evolved from the knightly sword became longer, and therefore the length of a longsword, which was up to 120 centimeters or 47 inch long, with a blade length of 90 centimeter or 35 inch, and a hilt length of 30 centimeter or 12 inch, and could be wielded with 1 or 2 hands. They usually did weigh around 1.3 kilograms or 2.6 pounds. Some of those swords are often called bastard swords, but they are not really bastard swords. Those swords were used throughout the 14th and 15th century and were part of many fencing schools like the Lichtenauerische Schule. Yep, German words. It's nearly impossible to differentiate these long swords from the in the middle of the 14th century arising two-handed sword, or sometimes called a war sword, as the length increased slowly over time. But later swords could hardly be wielded with one hand, therefore differentiate way more from the long swords. They were up to 20 centimeters or 8 inch longer than the prior described longsword and up to 0.3 kilogram or 0.6 pounds heavier. The longswords were earlier mainly wielded in one hand and later in two hands according to the fighting manuals. The term longsword you often hear in media, which some would say include 1.5-handed swords, another word for bastard swords, and two-handed swords, comes from the German word langes Schwert or Langschwert, which was the name referred to a weapon used for a fighting style with two hands on the grip. The term longsword therefore refers to all swords that can be wielded with one or two hands, as with the two-handed sword and greatsword that came after the term langes Schwert was coined, were able to differentiate more from the long swords not only by size but also by terminology. Therefore the term longsword, in my opinion, does only refer to weapons that were used with one or two hands and does not refer to weapons that were only used with two hands. The name bastard sword came in use as it was a mixture of a one-handed and the then longer two-handed sword. Henry VIII made the distinction between the two-handed sword and the bastard sword, which both evolved from the longsword, which sometimes still was in use during that time. But this is not what Henry VIII is known for. So what is now the difference between the longsword and the bastard sword? The longsword just got longer over time and thereby went from a one-handed sword to one that was wielded one or two-handed to later mainly two hands. Some are very similar to bastard swords in blade and grip length and came in use within the 14th century. In contrast, a true bastard sword's grip was made deliberately 1.5 hands long, and the pommel was designed to fit in the hand for more leverage. And the term bastard sword came in use within the 16th century. The main difference, however, is just the terminology of those weapons. That is why people call some long swords bastard swords, to specify the proportions of the weapon instead of the evolution or design. As we know now how those weapons differentiate, it is the bastard sword, the true bastard sword, and the longsword that are famous among media. For the rest of the video, I will use the term longsword to describe those three kinds of swords. Let us now talk about the real benefits and setbacks of longswords. Longswords were shorter and lighter than two-handed swords and therefore usable with one or two hands, which made them more versatile compared to one-handed or two-handed swords. A longsword can have similar reach to a two-handed sword despite its shorter length while it is wielded with one hand, and you have a smaller area to defend than when you wield a weapon with two hands. That may not matter while you wear plate armor, but against a combatant with less or no protection, this gives you a big advantage. The longsword, due to its length, could become more narrow to be a better piercing weapon, while still keeping enough mass to be an effective cutting weapon, with a higher range than a one-handed sword. But one weak point that many swords of that kind have are the tips, where the fuller ends at the ridge becomes thicker. Those tips could break easier due to the combination of a cutting and thrusting weapon of that length. There is more to it, but it would go beyond the scope of this video. The longsword is a weapon that you can use well for self-defense. It's shorter, so you can carry it around easier than a two-handed sword. Also, the draw time is shorter. Still, it gives you the option to hit harder blows with two hands. For other reasons which are important in the next part of the video, it is easier to fight with a shorter blade within a smaller space like a bar or a ship. You can interact easier with the world around you when you have a hand free. Also, there are things that require a free hand, like riding a horse or grapple someone. As you can see, many of the things we have talked about until now can either apply to a two-handed sword or a one-handed sword, but never to both. Which brings us to the most interesting part. Why is it so beloved by media? First of all, longer weapons are often very unwieldy for movie scenes. You want to have a relatively close combat with shots that show expressions of the combatants. Therefore, and other reasons I will talk about, even two-handed swords in fight scenes are shorter than they would normally be. A longsword in the hands of a relatively untrained person could hit props at the set like roofs, walls, ships, barrels and rocks, even when the fight scenes are trained and choreographed. It goes so far that they have smaller swords for some scenes that happen in smaller spaces, so it still looks good. Imagine Henry Cavill as the Witcher using a longsword like a rapier and just use thrusts because he fights a monster within a narrow house or ruin, instead of having those wide strong swings that look good on a character like Geralt. Despite using thrust would be more realistic in such a circumstance. Talking about The Witcher, within a fantasy setting magic needs to be presented somehow. Sometimes you need a free hand to show how magic is cast, as it looks absolutely weird when without any hand motion a spell effect is shown. And then the warrior still needs to be able to fight with the sword in the other hand, which makes the more versatile sword the better option. Another point is that the bastard sword shows the perfect balance between skill, power and adaptability. Most protagonists have heroic stories that include leadership and brotherhood, and the swords they wield need to capture this character. No one wants to see the heroic protagonist with a toothpick. The choice for that weapon in an adventure-like setting, which many of those fantasy books, movies, series and games are, also makes a lot of sense. As the weapon is versatile, you can fight different kinds of people or creatures with different armor and weapons with just one weapon. Another very good reason is to show how the protagonist starts to fight with two hands, to imply the seriousness of that fight or to make a finishing blow just to spice up the action scene. Compared to one-handed swords, longswords are long enough so it does not look ridiculous when you are half-swording them, which is a thing that is kinda overdone by movies and series. The next thing, which is also a big thing most people don't think about, are scabbards. Shorter scabbards are easier to wield and interfere less with props, other people or animals. For that reason, the weapons are often carried within a back scabbard, which many pointed out are not very historical. Maybe the most important reason to use a longsword is the ability to interact with the world. As already said, with magic, but you could also use a shield, throw a chair, tip over a table, grapple someone or throw a MacGuffin to another person. All those things make a longsword a great choice for books, movies, series, video games and even tabletop role-playing games. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. If you like what you've seen, please share, like, subscribe, and we see us in the next one.